My husband threw a lavish party to celebrate winning a massive $15 million tech acquisition. Just as the lobster was served to the elite crowd in our Atlanta mansion, a waiter deliberately spilled ice water all over my silk dress. While my mother publicly scolded me for ruining the night, the waiter pulled me into the hallway, pressed a flash drive into my hand, and whispered a secret that made my blood run cold. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Vivian, 34 years old, and until that night, I thought I knew the man I married and the family that raised me. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the grand foyer of our $4 million Atlanta estate. It was supposed to be a night of absolute triumph. My husband Julian stood at the head of the massive dining table. The expensive chandelier cast a warm golden glow over his perfectly tailored tuxedo. The dining room was packed with the most influential figures in our circle. There were the senior elders from my parents' megachurch, wealthy local socialites dripping in diamonds, and the arrogant tech investors brought in by my brother-in-law Trevor. I sat near the end of the long table wearing a midnight blue silk dress that Julian had chosen for me. I kept my hands neatly folded in my lap, playing the role of the supportive and quiet wife. Julian tapped his silver spoon against his glass of expensive champagne. The room fell completely silent, every single eye fixed on his charismatic and handsome face. He launched into a grand speech about his latest victory. He proudly announced a $15 million tech acquisition that would elevate his investment banking career into the stratosphere of elite venture capitalism. He thanked his business partners. He thanked the wealthy investors sitting at our table. And then his gaze shifted down the long table to where I was sitting. His smile turned into a patronizing smirk that made my stomach twist. And of course, Julian announced, his voice projecting effortlessly across the room, "I have to thank my quiet little wife Vivian. While I am out grinding, securing these multi-million-dollar deals, she is perfectly content staying home. She plays on her laptop in her sweatpants and keeps the house quiet so the real breadwinner can work." Laughter erupted around the dining table. It was not a warm or familial laughter. It was the sharp and condescending chuckle of people who viewed me as nothing more than a background accessory. I looked across the table at my mother Brenda, the highly esteemed First Lady of our church. Instead of defending her own daughter, she leaned forward, her heavy gold earrings swung against her neck as she shot me a harsh glare. "Sit up straight, Vivian," my mother hissed loud enough for the church elders next to her to hear clearly. "You are slouching like a commoner. Do not embarrass your husband tonight. He has worked too hard for this success." I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and forced a polite, empty smile onto my face. I did not argue with her. I never did. When Julian proposed to me 8 years ago on a quiet beach, he had promised we would always be equal partners. He told me he admired my brilliant mind and my dedication to my craft. But as his career in finance skyrocketed, his need for a trophy wife completely eclipsed his respect for my intellect. He systematically pushed me into the shadows over the years. He hid me from his high society life and treated my passion for coding and data architecture as a cute little hobby that kept me busy. What neither Julian nor my mother knew was that my cute little hobby was actually a highly lucrative boutique cybersecurity firm. I had built it from the ground up entirely under a secure corporate alias. I was secretly wealthy and highly respected in my industry. But I kept my success a closely guarded secret. I preferred the peace of my home office to the exhausting and toxic performance of their constant social climbing. It was my only sanctuary away from the relentless judgment of my own flesh and blood. My younger sister Monique sat a few seats away. She was a luxury real estate agent who thrived on attention and validation. She was the undisputed golden child of the family. My parents worshipped the ground she walked on because she fit perfectly into their shallow world of appearances. She sat next to her white husband Trevor, a Silicon Valley tech bro who constantly appropriated Black culture while looking down his nose at our entire family. Trevor believed he was the smartest man in any room he walked into. He loved nothing more than making me feel incompetent, often explaining basic computer concepts to me as if I were a child. The fact that Julian was now doing business with Trevor only made the evening more unbearable. As the catering staff began serving the main course of butter-poached lobster, a young African-American waiter approached my side of the table. I recognized him vaguely from the catering company we hired. His name tag read Malik. He moved with a quiet efficiency that usually went unnoticed by the wealthy guests. As he leaned in to refill my crystal water glass, his hand suddenly jerked forward. A cascade of freezing ice water spilled directly onto my lap, soaking the entire front of my expensive silk dress. I gasped loudly and jumped up from my chair as the freezing water soaked through to my skin. The sophisticated conversation at the table ground to an immediate halt. Everyone turned to look at me. Monique rolled her eyes dramatically and whispered something to Trevor, who snickered into his wineglass. My father, Reverend Vernon, shook his head in absolute disappointment, muttering a prayer for patience. My mother threw her linen napkin down on the table in absolute disgust. "Good Lord, Vivian?" My mother scolded, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You always find a way to ruin everything. Go clean yourself up before you make a bigger mess of Julian's special night. You are making a fool of yourself in front of the congregation members." Malik looked completely horrified. He bowed his head apologetically and grabbed a clean white towel from his apron. "I am so sorry, ma'am," he stammered nervously. "Please let me help you to the hallway so you can dry off." Humiliated and with the cruel laughter of my family ringing in my ears, I let Malik guide me out of the dining room. We walked into the dim and quiet corridor near the bustling kitchen. The moment the heavy oak doors swung shut behind us, cutting off the noise of the party, Malik's entire demeanor changed instantly. The clumsy and apologetic waiter completely vanished. He stood up straight and his eyes darted around the hallway to ensure we were entirely alone. He reached deep into his apron pocket and pressed a small, cold metal object into my palm. It was a highly encrypted flash drive. I looked at him completely bewildered and opened my mouth to ask what exactly was going on. He grabbed my forearm tightly. His grip was firm and full of urgent energy. "Listen to me very carefully," Vivian Malik whispered. His voice was intense and low. "Julian did not win a project. He stole your company's core security algorithm to sell to your brother-in-law Trevor." The air was instantly knocked out of my lungs. My mind raced in a million directions. How did this random waiter know about my private company? How did he know about the highly complex algorithm I had spent 3 grueling years writing and perfecting? My algorithm was an advanced digital fortress designed to protect sensitive financial data. It was worth millions, and I kept it secured on a private server. The only person who had access to my home network was Julian. Before I could process the initial shock, Malik continued speaking. He delivered a blow that shattered my reality entirely. "That $15 million acquisition they are celebrating in there right now," Malik said softly. "That is your technology being sold out from under you. But that is not even the worst part. At exactly 9 o'clock tonight, Julian is emptying all your joint bank accounts. He is boarding a private flight to Paris with his mistress, and he is leaving you with absolutely nothing." I stared down at the black flash drive resting in my hand. My pulse pounded in my ears like a massive war drum. The room seemed to spin slightly as the weight of the betrayal crashed down on my shoulders. Julian, the man who smiled at me this morning and kissed my cheek, was planning to steal my life's work and leave me destitute. Trevor and Monique were likely in on the deal, laughing at my expense while securing their own wealth. And my parents were out there praising the very man who was currently destroying their daughter. Malik checked his wristwatch. "It is 8:15 right now," he said. His eyes locked onto mine with absolute and terrifying seriousness. "You have exactly 45 minutes before your husband destroys your life. I am giving you the tools to stop him, but you have to move fast. The drive contains his travel itinerary, his offshore account numbers, and the backdoor access logs he used to breach your server." I took a deep breath, letting the icy shock fade away and allowing a cold, calculated anger to take its place. I tightened my fingers around the flash drive. The years of staying quiet, the years of biting my tongue while my family belittled me, all of it vanished in that single second. I looked back at the heavy oak doors leading to the dining room. I could hear the faint sound of Julian laughing with the investors, a sound that now filled me with pure disgust. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I was just a naive, socially awkward woman who could be easily discarded. "Who are you?" I asked Malik, keeping my voice steady and professional. "Why are you helping me?" Malik gave me a grim smile. "My sister used to work for Julian 3 years ago at the investment firm. He stole her financial models, took credit for her hard work, ruined her career, and blackmailed her until she almost took her own life. I have been watching him for a long time, waiting for the right moment to burn his empire down. I knew he was planning this betrayal, and I knew you were the only one smart enough to stop him. Consider me a friend who wants to see justice served tonight." I nodded slowly, fully processing the gravity of the situation. I did not shed a single tear. I did not panic. I calmly wiped the remaining water off my silk dress and reached into the hidden lining of my shoe. I pulled out a tiny burner phone that I kept for extreme security emergencies related to my business. The quiet, obedient wife my family thought they knew was gone forever. The woman standing in this hallway was a highly skilled cybersecurity expert who was about to unleash absolute hell. "It is time to initiate the Ashes protocol," I whispered to myself, powering on the encrypted device. I quickly typed in a sequence of override commands blocking my personal servers and preparing a digital trap. I looked at Malik and thanked him. I told him to step back into the kitchen and stay out of the crossfire. I turned back toward the dining room doors, my mind rapidly calculating my next moves. I had 45 minutes to dismantle a $15 million fraud, expose my cheating husband, and finally show my arrogant family exactly who they had been messing with all these years. The real party was just about to begin. The ambient noise of the party washed over me like a suffocating wave. The clinking of crystal, the pretentious laughter, the low hum of classical music playing from the string quartet in the corner. I walked slowly toward my seat at the long banquet table. The icy water soaked into the silk of my midnight blue dress, clinging uncomfortably to my skin, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. I did not shrink. I did not lower my eyes. I took my seat next to my husband, who was still deep in conversation with a wealthy church elder, completely ignoring my return. Across the table, Trevor leaned back in his chair, swirling an expensive glass of red wine. He had that insufferable smirk plastered across his face, the one he always wore when he felt particularly superior. Trevor was a man born on third base who spent his entire life loudly congratulating himself for hitting a triple. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and locked his eyes on me, clearly eager to resume the humiliation where my mother had left off. He cleared his throat loudly enough to draw the attention of the investors seated nearby. "You know," Vivian Trevor began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Julian and I were just talking about how much free time you have these days. It must be nice sitting around the house all day puttering away on your little laptop. But honestly, I think it is time you got out of the house. You need a purpose." I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was performing for his peers, establishing his dominance by belittling a black woman in front of a captive audience. Trevor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the imported linen tablecloth. "I am launching a new tech startup next week," he continued, his eyes gleaming with unearned pride. "We just acquired this revolutionary artificial intelligence security algorithm. It is brilliant tech, truly next-level stuff. I managed to secure the core architecture for absolute pennies from a desperate developer. It is going to change the entire landscape of data defense. Since we are scaling up so quickly, we are going to need some low-level administrative help. Data entry, organizing files, fetching coffee, that sort of thing. I could talk to human resources and get you an entry-level position. It would give you something to do besides waiting for Julian to come home and pay the bills." I stared at his smug face, feeling a dangerous calm settle over my entire body. Trevor had no idea that the revolutionary artificial intelligence he was boasting about was my life's work. He had no idea that the desperate developer he bought it from was my own husband, who had stolen it directly from my encrypted servers. And he certainly had no idea that the code he just paid millions for was currently sitting on my burner phone, waiting for my command to self-destruct. Looking at Trevor's pale, arrogant face, I was violently pulled back to a Thanksgiving dinner exactly 5 years ago. The memory tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. We had been sitting around my parents' massive dining table surrounded by the smell of roasted turkey and expensive sage stuffing. But there was no holiday joy in the air that night. Trevor and Monique had just been hit with a massive civil lawsuit. Trevor had launched a reckless real estate venture using Monique's broker license, and they had defrauded several high-net-worth clients. They were facing total financial ruin and potential criminal charges. Instead of letting them face the consequences of their own greed, my father, Reverend Vernon, had summoned me to his private study before dessert was served. He closed the heavy wooden doors and looked at me with cold, commanding eyes. He did not ask for my help. He demanded it. "Your sister made a mistake," my father had said, his deep preacher voice leaving no room for argument. "The church cannot afford the scandal of my eldest daughter going to prison. I know you have been saving money for your advanced degree, Vivian. You are going to transfer those funds to Trevor's legal team in the morning. Family protects family. It is your duty before God to save your sister." I had begged him not to make me do it. I had worked 3 exhausting jobs to save that money, denying myself every basic comfort to build a future. But my mother had stepped out from the shadows of the study, her face twisted in disgust. She told me I was being selfish. She said Monique was destined for greatness, while I was just a plain, boring girl who would never amount to anything anyway. They bullied, shamed, and spiritually manipulated me until I signed away every single cent of my savings. Trevor and Monique walked away without a scratch, completely insulated from their own failure, while I had to rebuild my entire life from absolute zero. And now, 5 years later, this mediocre man was sitting at my dining table, offering me a minimum wage job at a company he was building with my stolen technology. I placed my glass down on the table. The soft clink of the crystal seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of the room. "Thank you for the generous offer, Trevor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "But I assure you I am entirely capable of managing my own career. Besides, from what I understand about your new venture, it might not be as stable as your investors think." Trevor's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a brief flash of confusion crossing his features, before his arrogance quickly masked it again. He scoffed loudly and shook his head, looking around at his colleagues, as if asking them to share in the joke. "Well, do not say I never tried to help the less fortunate," he muttered, taking another large gulp of his wine. Monique, sensing that the spotlight was drifting away from her and her husband, immediately chimed in. She sat up straight, pushing her chest out to display the designer gown my parents had undoubtedly paid for. She reached across the table, her perfectly manicured fingernails tapping aggressively against the polished wood. "Actually, Vivian, since you are clearly not doing anything important tomorrow, I need a favor." Monique announced, her tone making it abundantly clear that it was not a request. "Trevor is hosting a massive gala tomorrow night to celebrate the new acquisition. All of his venture capital partners are flying in from San Francisco. It is a highly exclusive event, the kind of room you would not feel comfortable in anyway. But I need to look absolutely perfect. I need those vintage diamond earrings you are wearing." I felt a sharp prickle of irritation at the base of my neck. The earrings she was pointing at were not just jewelry. They were a breathtaking pair of heirloom diamonds that I had purchased for myself after securing my first major corporate cybersecurity contract. They were a private symbol of my resilience, a reward for surviving the financial devastation my family had put me through. Julian had insisted I wear them tonight to make him look good. I lightly touched the cool diamond resting against my right earlobe. "I do not think so, Monique," I replied softly. "These hold a lot of sentimental value to me. I am sure you have plenty of jewelry in your own collection that will impress Trevor's friends." Monique's eyes narrowed into angry, resentful slits. The sweet, bubbly facade she used for the church elders instantly melted away, revealing the spoiled, entitled child underneath. She slammed her hand flat against the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "I am not asking, Vivian," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "Trevor needs his investors to see that we belong in the Billionaire Boys Club. Those earrings are wasted on you. You never leave the house. You never network. You just sit around looking frumpy. Hand them over. I will send my assistant to pick them up in the morning." Before I could utter a single word in my defense, a heavy hand clamped down violently on my left wrist. I flinched and turned my head. My mother Brenda had leaned over from her seat, her fingers digging painfully into my skin. Her perfectly painted lips were pulled back in a tight, angry snarl. "Give your sister the earrings," Vivian, my mother commanded in a harsh whisper, leaning so close I could smell the strong mint and expensive gin on her breath. "Stop being so incredibly selfish. Monique is trying to build an empire with her husband. You are just a housewife. You have absolutely no need for diamonds like that. Take them off right now before you ruin this evening entirely." The sheer audacity of the moment hung in the air. The wealthy guests seated around us had gone completely silent, their eyes darting back and forth between me, my mother, and my glaring sister. They were watching a public execution, waiting to see how the quiet, subservient wife would submit to her family's demands. They expected me to lower my head, apologize for my selfishness, and hand over my prized possessions to keep the peace. That was the role I had played my entire life. I looked at my mother's hand gripping my wrist. I felt the sharp sting of her fingernails pressing into my flesh. I looked at Monique, who was smiling triumphantly, already anticipating her victory. I looked at Trevor, who was shaking his head in mock pity. And finally, I looked at my husband Julian. He was staring at his phone, completely ignoring the fact that his wife was being physically and verbally assaulted at his own celebration dinner. The countdown timer in my head was ticking away. I knew that in less than 30 minutes, Julian planned to vanish with every penny I had ever earned. I knew that my entire family was complicit in a web of lies, theft, and profound betrayal. They believed they had completely broken my spirit. They believed I was utterly powerless. I slowly turned my wrist, breaking my mother's grip with a sudden firm twist that made her gasp in shock. I maintained unbroken eye contact with Monique as I reached up to my earlobes. My fingers moved with deliberate, unhurried grace. I unclasped the right diamond earring, feeling the cold metal slide away from my skin. I reached up and unclasped the left one, resting both heavy, glittering jewels in the palm of my hand. Monique held out her open hand, a greedy, victorious smile stretching across her face. "I told you," she sneered softly. "You always do what you are told." I did not hand them to her. Instead, I extended my arm over the center of the table, holding my hand directly above Monique's half-full glass of expensive vintage champagne. I opened my fingers. The heavy diamond earrings plummeted downward. They hit the bubbling liquid with a sharp splash, sinking instantly to the bottom of the crystal flute. Monique shrieked and jumped back in her chair as drops of champagne splattered across her pristine designer gown. My mother let out a loud gasp of absolute horror, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The entire dining room erupted into shocked murmurs and frantic whispers. I offered Monique a sweet, chilling smile. "Keep them," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the sudden quiet of the room. "Fake diamonds for a fake empire. I think they suit you perfectly." Monique's face turned a violent shade of crimson. She scrambled to her feet, her chair screeching harshly against the polished marble floor. Her mouth opened wide, ready to scream a torrent of abuse, ready to demand my immediate removal from the house. But before a single sound could escape her throat, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. Julian suddenly stood up from the head of the table. The smooth, confident posture he had maintained all evening was completely gone. His face was the color of dirty chalk, pale and sweating profusely under the warm light of the chandelier. He was trembling slightly, and in his hands he clutched a thick, bulging manila folder. He did not look at me. He did not look at the spilled champagne or his furious sister-in-law. He stared blankly ahead, addressing the room of elite guests, with a voice that quivered with manufactured sorrow. "Please, everyone, please be quiet," Julian stammered, raising his hand to silence the room. "I apologize for the disruption. I am afraid I have to interrupt this celebration." I have a deeply heartbreaking family matter that I must share with all of you right now. The heavy oak doors of the dining room had barely settled when Julian cleared his throat. He held a thick manila folder against his chest like a shield. The entire room fell into a breathless hush. I watched him shift his weight, perfectly executing the posture of a broken man. He looked down at the polished marble floor and let out a long, trembling sigh. It was a masterful performance. "I have to apologize to all of you, Julian," began his voice thick with manufactured emotion. "We invited you here tonight to celebrate a milestone, but I can no longer hide the painful reality of what goes on behind closed doors in this house." He looked up, sweeping his gaze across the tech investors, the church elders, and finally my parents. His eyes were wide and brimming with fake tears. "My wife Vivian is very sick." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A collective gasp rippled through the elite guests. Monique covered her mouth in feigned shock, while Trevor nodded solemnly as if he had known all along. Julian stepped away from his chair and began untying the string of the manila folder. For the past 2 years, Vivian has been suffering from a severe and rapidly deteriorating mental condition. It started with mild paranoia, but it has escalated into complete delusions. She believes people are stealing from her. She thinks her own family is conspiring against her. I have tried everything to get her the help she needs quietly, but her outburst tonight with the earrings proves that she is a danger to herself and to the reputation of everyone in this room. He began pulling out thick stacks of paper bound by heavy black clips. He handed them to Trevor, who eagerly began passing them down the table to the venture capitalists and the church board members. I watched in total silence as my life was legally and medically erased. "These are certified psychiatric evaluations," Julian said, wiping a non-existent tear from his cheek. "I had a private team of specialists observe her behavior and review her medical history. They have concluded that Vivian is experiencing a complete mental break. They strongly recommend immediate inpatient care at a secure psychiatric facility." I did not need to look at the papers to know what they contained. Julian had bought those evaluations. With enough money, you can purchase any reality you desire. I watched the church elders flipping through the forged documents, their faces contorting into expressions of deep pity and disgust. They were reading fabricated stories of me screaming at invisible enemies, of me forgetting where I was, of me hoarding money out of a psychotic fear of poverty. My mother Brenda was wiping her eyes with a lace napkin, sobbing loudly enough to make sure everyone knew how much she was suffering. Julian walked slowly toward my end of the table. He pulled 2 final documents from the folder and laid them gently on the table in front of me. One was a post-nuptial agreement. The other was a set of divorce papers. "Vivian." "I love you," Julian whispered loud enough for the entire room to hear. "And because I love you, I cannot let you destroy yourself or the empire we are trying to protect. The doctors are waiting outside right now. They have an ambulance ready to take you to a private facility in upstate New York, where you can rest and heal away from the pressures of society. But before you go, you need to sign these." He tapped the thick stacks of legal paper. "I am offering you a generous exit. Sign the house over to me. Sign over any claims to my business assets and investments. In exchange, I will personally fund your psychiatric care for as long as it takes. If you refuse to sign, Vivian, I will have no choice but to have you involuntarily committed and let the court seize everything you have. I will not let your sickness drag my new acquisition down." The sheer audacity of his plan was breathtaking. He was not just stealing my technology. He was stealing my freedom. He was going to lock me in a psychiatric ward so I could never tell the authorities about the $15 million algorithm he stole from my servers, and he was doing it right in front of my own family. I looked down at the documents. The divorce papers listed me as an indigent spouse surrendering all marital property due to severe mental incapacity. It was the perfect crime. I waited for someone to speak up. I waited for my mother to jump from her seat and snatch the papers away. I waited for my father, the revered man of God, to demand an explanation. Instead, the heavy silence was broken by the scraping of a chair. "Reverend Vernon." My father stood up at the head of the table. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and puffed out his chest. He looked at me not with the eyes of a loving father, but with the cold, calculating glare of a businessman protecting his investments. "Sign the papers, Vivian," my father commanded. His voice boomed through the dining room, vibrating with the same theatrical authority he used to command his congregation on Sunday mornings. "Do not bring shame to my church. Do not humiliate this family any further. Julian has been a saint to tolerate your erratic behavior for this long. We have all seen how you isolate yourself, how you sit in the dark, staring at computer screens, refusing to participate in the blessed life we have provided for you. You are sick, Vivian. Accept the grace your husband is offering you." I stared at the man who gave me life. This was the same man who had forced me to drain my college savings to cover Monique's legal fees 5 years ago. This was the man who always looked the other way when Julian belittled me because Julian's generous tithes kept the megachurch operating. My father was perfectly willing to let me be declared insane and locked away in a facility just so Julian could keep his stolen millions and continue funding my family's luxurious lifestyle. Brenda slammed her hand on the table, nodding vigorously. "Listen to your father, Vivian. You have always been troubled. Even as a child, you never fit in. We tried our best with you, but we cannot let your illness ruin your sister's future or Julian's career. Sign the papers and go get the help you desperately need. Do it for the family." Trevor leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "Wow, I knew you were a little off, but this is intense." "Just sign the papers," Vivian Trevor sneered. "It is over. You do not have the mental capacity to fight this. Just take the free health care and let the adults handle the business." I looked at Julian, who was holding out an expensive gold-plated fountain pen. His hand was steady. His eyes were completely dead. He believed he had won. He believed the quiet, obedient wife would simply crumble under the weight of her family's combined rejection. He thought the threat of public humiliation and forced institutionalization would break my mind just like they had claimed in those fake reports. I slowly reached out and took the gold pen from Julian's hand. A collective sigh of relief washed over the dining room. My mother stopped her theatrical crying. Monique smiled brightly, leaning her head on Trevor's shoulder. Julian let out a small, triumphant breath and pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the divorce decree. I did not look at the paper. I looked directly into Julian's eyes. I wrapped both of my hands around the thick gold barrel of the pen. With a sudden vicious snap, I broke the expensive pen completely in half. Black ink splattered across the crisp white divorce papers and dotted Julian's pristine tuxedo shirt. Julian stumbled backward, his mouth falling open in shock. "What are you doing?" he yelled. My father slammed his fist on the table, shouting my name. I ignored them all. I calmly reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and pulled out my small encrypted burner phone. The device Malik had seen me use in the hallway. The device connected to the absolute core of my private servers. I tapped the screen once, entering a single override command. A deafening mechanical grinding noise suddenly erupted from within the walls of the mansion. The wealthy guests shrieked and covered their ears as the sound vibrated through the floorboards. Heavy steel security shutters began descending rapidly over every single window in the dining room. The reinforced titanium plates slammed down over the glass patio doors, sealing out the night sky. The main entrance doors locked with a loud, heavy click, engaging the biometric deadbolts. The smart home system I had personally designed and installed went into full lockdown mode. The ambient lighting in the dining room snapped off, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before the emergency backup lights flickered on, casting a harsh, cold glow over the terrified faces of my family and their elite friends. "What is going on?" Trevor yelled, jumping up from his chair and running toward the locked patio doors. He pounded his fists against the cold steel shutters. "Open the doors, Julian. Tell your crazy wife to open the doors." Julian was frantically tapping the wall-mounted security panel, but the screen was completely dead. "Vivian, stop this right now." Julian commanded, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "The police are going to be here any minute. You are proving my point. You are acting completely insane. Turn off the security system." I slowly stood up from my chair, smoothing the wet silk of my dress. I walked past Julian, completely ignoring his frantic attempts to grab my arm. I moved to the head of the long dining table, forcing my father to take a step back. I stood exactly where Julian had stood when he first humiliated me. I tapped another button on my phone. The massive 80-inch television mounted on the far wall of the dining room suddenly flickered to life. The screen was completely black except for a giant bright red digital countdown timer in the dead center. The numbers began to tick down in absolute silence. 30 minutes and 0 seconds. 29 minutes and 59 seconds. 29 minutes and 58 seconds. The room descended into a state of paralyzed terror. The church elders were clutching their chests. Monique was sobbing real tears, now hiding behind Trevor. My mother was backed against the wall, staring at me, as if she had never seen me before in her entire life. And Julian stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the red numbers, ticking away his $15 million escape plan. I placed my hands flat on the table and looked at the crowd of people who had just eagerly agreed to lock me away in a mental institution. "Nobody leaves," I said, my voice dropping an octave, resonating with a terrifying calm that made my father flinch. "You all wanted to sit here and watch a spectacle. You all wanted to gorge yourselves on expensive food while my husband stripped me of my life and my freedom. You wanted to call me crazy. Well, if you want a show, let us give the congregation a real sermon." The silence in the dining room shattered into a million jagged pieces. Panic erupted around the long table as the reality of the locked steel shutters finally registered with the wealthy guests. The church elders began to murmur frantically among themselves, while the venture capitalists pulled out their cell phones, only to realize that the signal jammer I had activated was completely blocking their connection to the outside world. Chairs scraped violently against the polished marble floor. Several people stood up and paced around the enclosed space like trapped animals. The red digital timer on the massive television screen continued to tick down in absolute silence. 29 minutes and 40 seconds. 29 minutes and 39 seconds. Trevor pushed his chair back with so much force that it toppled over and crashed onto the floor. His face was twisted into a mask of pure rage. The smug Silicon Valley superiority he had worn all evening evaporated instantly. He stomped toward the head of the table where I was sitting. His heavy footsteps echoed in the chaotic room. Trevor was a large man who used his physical size to intimidate people whenever his intellect failed him. He stopped right next to my chair and leaned over me. He placed both of his large hands flat on the table, effectively trapping me in my seat. I could smell the expensive red wine on his breath and see the veins bulging in his neck. "Listen to me very carefully, you crazy woman," Trevor sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "I do not know what kind of stunt you think you are pulling tonight, but you are messing with the wrong people. I have a team of corporate lawyers who will destroy you by tomorrow morning. I will use every single connection I have in the tech industry to make sure you are locked in a padded cell for the rest of your natural life. Open these doors right now before I physically force you to give me that phone." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with him. For years, I had watched this mediocre man belittle me at family gatherings. I had listened to him appropriate black culture when it suited his edgy tech bro aesthetic, while simultaneously treating the black people in his own family like uneducated burdens. He thought his wealth and his Silicon Valley pedigree made him an untouchable god in this room. He thought I was just a fragile housewife having a mental breakdown. He was profoundly wrong. I kept my face perfectly still and slowly tapped a sequence of commands into my burner phone. "Trevor, you always did love the sound of your own voice," I said calmly. "But since you are so eager to talk about your brilliant tech industry connections, let us share your real resume with the rest of the room." I pressed the final button on my phone. I had anticipated Trevor coming to this party, and I had already intercepted his unsecured mobile network access the moment he walked through my front door. The giant television screen on the wall flickered. The red countdown timer shifted to the right side of the screen, making room for a new display on the left. It was a direct mirror of Trevor's personal smartphone screen. Trevor blinked in confusion and reached into his tailored suit jacket to pull out his phone. He stared at his screen and then looked up at the television. His private emails, his text messages, and his banking applications were now completely visible to every single person in the dining room. "What are you doing to my phone?" Trevor demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its aggressive edge. "Turn that off right now." I ignored his demands and remotely opened a specific folder on his mirrored screen. The folder contained legal documents and source code from a startup company that went bankrupt exactly 3 years ago. I looked at the venture capitalists sitting at my table who were now staring intently at the television screen. "You see, Trevor loves to boast about his revolutionary ideas," I told the silent room. "But Trevor has never actually invented anything in his entire life." 3 years ago, he found a small, brilliant startup founded by 4 young black college students. They had developed a groundbreaking data sorting algorithm. Trevor pretended to be their mentor. He gained their trust and accessed their proprietary code. Then he used his massive wealth to bury those kids in frivolous intellectual property lawsuits until they could no longer afford to fight him. He bankrupted them, stole their life's work, and rebranded it as his own genius creation. That is how Trevor built his empire. He is a parasite who feeds on the brilliance of black creators while telling them they should be grateful for the exposure. Trevor stepped back from me, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The venture capitalists at the table began to whisper to each other, casting suspicious glances at Trevor. In their world, stealing tech was common, but getting caught with the stolen source code displayed on a giant screen was professional suicide. "That is a lie," Trevor shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is fabricating this data. She is completely insane. Do not listen to her." I smiled coldly and shifted my gaze to Julian, who was still standing near the broken fountain pen, looking absolutely terrified. "And that brings us to tonight," I continued, my voice projecting clearly across the vast dining room. Trevor thought he had found another easy target. He thought he could buy my highly advanced cybersecurity algorithm for absolute pennies. Julian stole my core architecture from my private servers last week and sold it to Trevor. Trevor was so eager to steal another black woman's work that he did not even bother to run a proper diagnostic check on the code before uploading it directly into his company's main servers. I watched Trevor pull his phone close to his chest, frantically trying to turn it off, but the device was completely locked under my remote control. The screen on the wall remained perfectly clear. "If you knew anything about actual cybersecurity, Trevor, I said you would know about a concept called a honeypot." A honeypot is a digital trap. It is a decoy server designed to look like a highly valuable target to lure in thieves and hackers. The code that Julian stole and sold to you was not my security algorithm. It was a honeypot filled with the most aggressive, self-replicating malware I have ever written. The moment I said the word malware, Trevor's mirrored phone screen began to flash violently. The room watched in absolute horror as a cascade of automated push notifications flooded his display. They were emergency alerts from his server administrators. I read them aloud for the benefit of the room. "Server Cluster 1 offline," I read calmly as the notification popped up. "Server Cluster 2 offline. Critical database, corruption detected. Main client directory deleted." Trevor let out a strangled gasp and began frantically tapping his useless phone. "No, no, no, this cannot be happening," he muttered, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. "Oh, it gets much better, Trevor," I said, leaning back in my chair. "My malware was not just designed to wipe your servers. It was designed to trace the financial pathways connected to the stolen code. It has completely infiltrated your venture capital accounts. It triggered an automated fraud alert with your banking institutions." Another notification appeared on the giant screen, this time from his primary financial institution. It was an automated message stating that all corporate and personal funds had been completely frozen, pending a federal investigation into unauthorized data manipulation. "You just lost your company, Trevor," I told him, staring directly into his panicked eyes. "You lost your investors' money. Your entire Silicon Valley empire has been reduced to digital ash because you were too arrogant to realize you were walking into a trap. You are bankrupt, and by tomorrow morning you will be facing federal charges for intellectual property theft. Trevor stood frozen, staring at the television screen as the notifications continued to pour in, confirming the absolute destruction of his life's work. The red timer on the right side of the screen ticked down to 25 minutes. The shock in the room quickly turned into raw, explosive violence. Trevor let out a guttural roar of pure rage. He turned away from the television screen and lunged directly at Julian. Julian tried to step back, but Trevor was too fast and too heavy. Trevor grabbed Julian by the collar of his expensive tuxedo shirt and slammed him violently against the dining room wall. The impact rattled the large framed paintings hanging nearby. "You ruined me!" Trevor screamed, spraying saliva onto Julian's face. "You told me the code was clean. You told me she was just a stupid housewife who would never know her files were missing. You sold me a virus, you incompetent fool." Julian struggled against Trevor's grip, his hands desperately pulling at Trevor's thick wrists. "I did not know." Julian gasped, struggling to breathe. She locked the files. "I thought I bypassed her security. I swear I did not know it was a trap." Trevor pulled his fist back and punched Julian hard in the jaw. Julian collapsed to the floor, knocking over a tall crystal vase that shattered into 100 pieces across the marble tiles. Trevor dropped down on top of him, grabbing him by the throat and slamming his head against the ground. The elegant victory party had completely devolved into a savage, brutal brawl. The wealthy guests backed away in horror, pressing themselves against the locked steel shutters to avoid the violence. Monique began to shriek uncontrollably. She stood frozen near her chair, watching her husband beat the man she had been conspiring with. She threw her hands in the air and turned desperately toward the head of the table. "Daddy, do something!" Monique screamed, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "Daddy, stop them! Trevor is going to kill him. Please, Dad, fix this right now." Reverend Vernon stepped forward, his face flushed with panic and anger. He raised his hands, attempting to use his commanding preacher voice to separate the two men fighting on the floor. "Trevor, get off of him!" Vernon shouted, moving toward the scuffle. "We can resolve this financially. There is no need for violence in my daughter's home." I watched my father attempt to play the peacemaker. He still believed he held the moral and financial authority in this room. He still believed he could sweep this disaster under the rug, with a few well-placed words and a promise of money. I picked up my phone and tapped one final command. The giant television screen shifted again. Trevor's locked phone display vanished entirely. The red countdown timer remained ticking away on the right side. But on the left side, a new series of documents appeared. They were highly confidential offshore bank statements spanning the last 2 years. The account names were clearly visible in large, bold letters. The transactions showed massive sums of money moving through a complex web of international shell companies. The sudden change on the bright screen caught the attention of the church elders who were huddled together near the wall. One of them pointed at the television and gasped loudly. Vernon stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes glued to the offshore accounts displayed on the screen. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of the powerful reverend he pretended to be. Trevor and Julian stopped their fighting, both men panting heavily on the floor, covered in sweat and spilled wine, as they too stared up at the massive display of financial records. The entire dining room fell into a suffocating, deathly silence. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the men on the floor and the steady, relentless ticking of the red countdown timer. I folded my hands neatly on the table and looked directly at my father. "Let us talk about the church's building fund, Dad," I said. My father's face twisted into a mask of pure indignation as the red numbers continued to tick down on the screen. For 30 years, Reverend Vernon had controlled every room he ever walked into by projecting the righteous wrath of God onto anyone who dared to question him. He puffed out his chest and took a heavy step toward me, raising his right hand high in the air as if he were standing at his polished oak pulpit on a Sunday morning. "Vivian, you will silence your wicked tongue this instant," he bellowed, his deep baritone voice rattling the crystal glasses left on the dining table. Honor thy father and thy mother, lest your days be cut short on this earth. You are possessed by a spirit of malice and pure paranoia tonight." He turned his attention to the crowd, waving his hands defensively. Elders do not listen to the mad ramblings of a sick and broken woman. She is deeply unwell, and she is trying to destroy the sanctity of this family to feed her own psychotic delusions. The wealthy church elders, who had been sitting in terrified silence, began to murmur anxiously among themselves. These were powerful men who wrote massive donation checks to my father's ministry, and they expected pristine reputations and financial transparency in return. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, adjusting their expensive ties and exchanging highly suspicious glances. Elder Davis, a prominent real estate developer who had personally funded the church's new youth wing, wiped a thick layer of sweat from his balding forehead. "Vernon, what is she talking about?" Elder Davis asked, his voice trembling slightly in the cold room. "What offshore accounts are these, and why are they on the screen?" Vernon opened his mouth to spin another web of holy lies, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I looked down at my encrypted burner phone and tapped the screen once more. The massive television display shifted seamlessly. The initial offshore bank statements dissolved and were instantly replaced by a series of high-resolution wire transfer receipts and internal church financial ledgers. The documents were incredibly detailed, showing specific routing numbers, exact dates, and bold red highlights circling massive cash withdrawals. I watched the blood completely drain from my father's face as the undeniable truth illuminated the dark room. "Let us walk through the holy ledger." "Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotion. "As you can all see on the screen, exactly $500,000 was withdrawn from the church's community building fund over the course of the last 8 months. That was money specifically donated by the elders in this room to build an orphanage and a community outreach center in the inner city. But the money never made it to the construction firm, did it, Dad?" The elders gasped audibly. Several of them stood up from the heavy wooden table, leaning much closer to the television screen to read the fine print of the banking documents. I pointed at the glowing screen. "If you follow the routing numbers, you will clearly see that Julian used his corporate law accounts to launder the church donations through 3 different untraceable shell companies. And where did all that tax-free charity money finally end up? It went directly into the failing corporate accounts of Monique's luxury real estate business to keep it from going completely under." Monique let out a pathetic whimpering sound and buried her face in her hands, trying to hide from the glaring eyes of the investors. Trevor, who had just finished beating Julian to a bloody pulp on the floor, stared up at the screen with his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. "But the most brilliant part of your holy fraud, Dad, is the signature block," I continued, my voice echoing steadily in the silent dining room. "Look very closely at the final authorization forms, elders. My father signed off on the transfer of the church funds, but the shell company receiving the stolen money lists me as the primary financial director." Julian forged my signature on all the corporate documents. They funneled $500,000 of stolen church donations into Monique's bank account, and they used my name to take the fall. This was exactly why Julian had been so desperate to have me declared mentally incompetent tonight. If I was locked away in a secure psychiatric ward, my credibility would be entirely destroyed forever. When the federal investigators inevitably came looking for the missing church funds, Julian and my father would simply point their fingers at the crazy wife. They were going to let me take the blame and go to federal prison for their own financial crimes. I looked at my father, and then I looked at Monique. The bitter taste of betrayal coated the back of my throat, but it was a very familiar flavor. They had done this exact same thing to me before. "You always loved using her pretty face in my brains, Dad," I said softly, watching him squirm under my gaze. The memory washed over me, pulling me back to when I was just 16 years old. I had spent 4 exhausting months organizing a massive charity food drive for our church. I stayed up until 3 in the morning every single night, building complex spreadsheets, contacting local farmers, negotiating transport logistics, and managing hundreds of volunteers. I built that entire charity program from the ground up with my own 2 hands. But when the local news stations came to the church on a Sunday morning to cover the massive success of the drive, my father had pulled me aside in the dark hallway. He had looked at my simple dress and my exhausted face with pure disdain. He told me to stay in the back hallway out of sight from the cameras. He said I was too awkward and too plain to be the public face of his growing ministry. Instead, he pulled Monique out of the youth choir. He put her in a beautiful, expensive dress, pushed her onto the brightly lit altar, and let her hand the giant novelty check to the mayor. My father stood proudly at the pulpit and told the entire congregation how deeply proud he was of Monique's brilliant charitable heart. He gave her all the glory for my sleepless nights, and he told me I should be grateful just to serve the Lord in the shadows. You used her face to collect the applause. Back then, I told my father, watching his hands shake, and tonight you used my name to take the fall for her crimes. You thought I was still that quiet 16-year-old girl who would just swallow her tears and take the punishment to protect your reputation. But I am not hiding in the hallway anymore, Dad. Elder Davis slammed his fist onto the dining room table, breaking the heavy tension in the room. This is an absolute disgrace, he yelled, his face turning purple with righteous rage. You stole from the congregation, Vernon. You stole from the children you swore to protect. I am calling the authorities right now. The other wealthy investors and church board members immediately reached into their tailored suits and pulled out their cell phones. The room was suddenly filled with the frantic tapping of screens and desperate muttering as they tried to contact the police. But their anger very quickly morphed into sheer, unadulterated panic. Elder Davis stared at his phone screen, tapping the glass violently. I have no signal, he announced, his voice rising in pitch and echoing with fear. There is no service in here. Trevor pulled out his own phone, his bruised and bleeding face contorting in terror. He is right. The network is completely dead. Emergency calls only, and even those will not connect. What did you do to the house, Vivian? I sat back in my chair at the head of the table, observing the absolute chaos unfolding around me. I warned you all that nobody is leaving this room, I said smoothly. When I triggered the security lockdown, I also activated a military-grade signal jammer hidden in the walls of this dining room. It completely blocks all cellular frequencies, Wi-Fi signals, and emergency communication bands. You are completely cut off from the outside world. Nobody is coming to save you. Nobody is coming to arrest you. You are all trapped in this room with the truth. The reality of their absolute confinement finally broke the last remaining shreds of their sanity. My mother, Brenda, could no longer maintain her arrogant, aristocratic facade. She collapsed onto the floor, her expensive pearls rattling loudly against the cold marble tiles. Her perfect makeup was completely ruined by her tears running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air, as if the room was rapidly running out of oxygen. She crawled toward my chair, her hands reaching out to grab the hem of my wet silk dress. Please, Vivian, she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Please stop this right now. You have made your point. You have ruined Julian. You have destroyed your father's church. You have ruined your sister's reputation. We have lost everything. Please, I am begging you as your mother, show some mercy and open the doors. Let us go. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was a massive disappointment. I looked at the woman who had happily agreed to lock me in a psychiatric ward just 30 minutes ago. I felt absolutely no pity for her tears. My heart was completely steady. I leaned forward and looked directly into my mother's terrified, pleading eyes. We aren't done yet, I whispered. Let's talk about why Monique really needed that $500,000. Monique let out a shrill, piercing sob that echoed off the high ceilings of the locked dining room. She stumbled forward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the expensive Persian rug. She looked frantically around the room at the faces of the church elders and the Silicon Valley investors seeking any drop of sympathy she could harvest. When she found only cold, judging stares, she turned her tear-streaked face toward me. You are just jealous of me! Vivian Monique cried out, her voice shaking with desperate theatrical agony. You have always been jealous of me. You are jealous of my beauty, and you are jealous of my success. You cannot stand the fact that I built a luxury real estate empire while you were stuck at home. So you fabricated all of these terrible lies to tear me down because you want everyone to hate me as much as you do. She spun around and lunged toward Trevor, reaching out to wrap her arms around his broad shoulders. Trevor, please tell them she is lying, Monique pleaded, burying her face against his ruined tuxedo shirt. Tell them your wife is a successful businesswoman. Protect me, Trevor. Trevor did not embrace her. He stood perfectly rigid, his chest heaving as the horrifying reality of the situation finally penetrated his arrogant mind. He looked at the massive television screen where the wire transfers clearly showed $500,000 of stolen church donations flowing directly into Monique's primary business accounts. His eyes widened as he connected the dots. If his wife was laundering stolen charity money through her real estate firm, then his own personal assets were legally entangled in a massive federal fraud case. Get off of me. Trevor snarled, his voice dropping into a dangerous guttural growl. He grabbed Monique by her upper arms and shoved her away with a violent, sudden force. Monique stumbled backward, crying out in shock as she crashed into the edge of the heavy wooden dining table. She caught her balance and stared at her husband with wide, terrified eyes. Trevor, you are hurting me, she whimpered. I should have known you were too stupid to run a legitimate business, Trevor shouted, taking a threatening step toward her. You told me those capital injections were from private overseas investors. You told me you were closing high-end luxury deals with anonymous buyers. But you were just washing stolen money for your sister's husband. You dragged my name into a federal money laundering conspiracy, you pathetic fraud. I watched Monique's beautiful, perfect facade shatter into a million jagged pieces. She looked at my father for help, but the great Reverend Vernon was entirely paralyzed by his own impending doom. He simply stared at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with his favorite daughter. I tapped the screen of my burner phone, bringing up a new set of documents on the giant television display. Let us take a closer look at that luxury real estate empire, I said, my voice cutting through Monique's pathetic sobbing. The screen illuminated the dark room with dozens of property deeds and closing statements from the last 2 years. I pointed toward the glowing display. Monique claims to be a top-tier real estate agent selling multi-million-dollar mansions to elite buyers across the state. But if you look at the public records, you will see that every single luxury home Monique supposedly sold over the last 24 months was purchased by a corporate shell entity. And every single one of those shell entities traces directly back to Julian's private legal firm. The venture capitalists in the room began to mutter to one another, pointing at the screen as the financial paper trail became undeniably clear. She never sold a single house to a real human being. I continued refusing to let Monique look away from the truth. Julian was embezzling massive amounts of money from his corporate clients. He needed a way to wash that dirty money so it looked like legitimate income. My father allowed Julian to funnel the cash through the church's tax-exempt charity accounts. Then the church wired that money to Monique's real estate firm under the guise of anonymous charitable investments. Monique used the stolen money to purchase high-end properties under fake corporate names, and then she immediately sold those properties back to other shell companies controlled by Julian. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool marble of the dining table. You are not a successful businesswoman, Monique, I told her softly. You have not closed a legitimate real estate deal in years. You are nothing but a glorified money mule. You are a criminal accessory dressed up in designer gowns, playing house with stolen money. Monique clamped her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes tightly shut, as if she could physically block out the sound of my voice. Stop it! She screamed, her voice cracking. Stop saying these things about me. I worked hard for everything I have. I earned my lifestyle. You earned absolutely nothing, I replied. Looking at her trembling frame, I was instantly transported back to the day I signed the lease on my very first apartment. It was a tiny, cramped studio in a terrible part of town with peeling paint and rattling pipes. I had invited my family over for a modest dinner to celebrate my independence. Monique had shown up 2 hours late. She walked into my tiny living room carrying a brand new $10,000 Birkin bag, resting on her arm like a royal scepter. She had refused to sit on my second-hand sofa, claiming it looked unsanitary. She stood in the middle of my small kitchen laughing at my cheap plates and my mismatched silverware. She told me my cheap lifestyle was embarrassing to the family name. She said I needed to manifest wealth like she did. She spent the entire evening boasting about a massive commission she had just earned on a waterfront property. She flaunted her expensive bag and her diamond rings, making sure I felt thoroughly inferior before she finally left to attend a luxury gala. I did not know it then, but that $10,000 bag had been purchased with money stolen from a charity fund meant for homeless children. She had stood in my modest, honest home and mocked my poverty while wearing the spoils of a federal crime. "You brought that disgusting Birkin bag to my first apartment," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Monique. "You mocked my second-hand furniture and you told me I lacked ambition. You stood there dripping in stolen wealth and called me a failure because I chose to earn my money honestly. You convinced yourself that the dirty money flowing through your bank account made you superior to me. But you are just a thief, Monique. You are a thief who let our father use my name on the authorization forms so I would take the fall when the authorities finally caught up with you." Monique dropped to her knees on the marble floor, wrapping her arms around her stomach as she wept uncontrollably. The golden child of the Vernon family was finally exposed to the harsh light of reality, and the absolute destruction of her ego was total and complete. The red digital timer on the screen ticked down to 19 minutes and 45 seconds. The quiet, steady pulsing of the numbers was a constant, terrifying reminder that the walls were closing in on everyone in the room. Julian was standing near the broken crystal vase, breathing heavily. His expensive tuxedo was ruined, covered in wine and dust from his violent scuffle with Trevor. He looked at the ticking timer and then glanced frantically toward the heavy steel shutters covering the windows. He knew exactly what that timer meant. He had booked a private charter flight out of the country, scheduled to depart in less than 2 hours. He had planned to walk out of this house with my $15 million and vanish into the night, leaving me trapped in a psychiatric ward. But now his funds were frozen, his crimes were exposed, and he was locked inside a fortress with no way out. He wiped a streak of blood from his split lip and began to slowly inch his way backward, moving away from the center of the dining room. He kept his eyes on Trevor, who was still glaring at Monique with pure disgust. Julian thought nobody was paying attention to him in the midst of the family drama. He took another silent step back, his expensive leather shoes sliding softly across the marble floor. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. The smart home system controlled every lock in the mansion, but Julian knew there was a manual override switch located in the utility pantry just off the main kitchen. It was a hardwired emergency release designed for fire safety. If he could sneak into the kitchen and pull that heavy lever, the steel shutters would raise and the biometric deadbolts would disengage. He could run out the back door, jump into his sports car, and speed away before the police inevitably arrived to sort out the massive financial fraud I had just broadcast to the room. Julian turned his body slightly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He reached the edge of the dining room archway and slipped silently into the darkened hallway that led toward the kitchen. I did not say a word. I did not alert the room to his attempted escape. I just sat at the head of the table and watched the red numbers tick down on the giant screen. 19 minutes and 10 seconds. Julian hurried down the dark corridor, his breathing fast and ragged. He pushed open the heavy swinging door to the kitchen. The emergency backup lights cast long, strange shadows across the stainless steel appliances and the large granite island. He scrambled toward the back corner of the room, reaching out for the utility pantry door handle. He was so close to freedom. He just needed to pull the release lever and run. He yanked the pantry door open, expecting to find the gray metal electrical panel and the bright red override switch. Instead, he found Malik. My brother Malik stepped out of the dark pantry, filling the doorway with his massive, intimidating frame. He was wearing a simple black hooded sweatshirt and dark jeans, blending perfectly into the shadows. He crossed his thick, muscular arms over his chest and looked down at Julian with a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. Going somewhere? Julian Malik asked, his voice deep and rumbling in the quiet kitchen. Julian gasped and stumbled backward, almost tripping over his own feet. Malik, what are you doing here? Julian stammered, raising his hands defensively. You need to let me pass. Vivian has lost her mind. She locked the house. I just need to pull the override switch to get everyone out safely. Malik chuckled, a dark, humorless sound that echoed off the stainless steel cabinets. He slowly stepped out of the pantry and closed the door firmly behind him, blocking Julian's only path to the override switch. My sister is doing exactly what she needs to do, Malik said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward Julian. And you are not touching that switch. You are going to walk right back into that dining room, and you are going to sit down until the timer runs out. Julian's panic escalated into sheer terror. Malik, please, you do not understand, Julian begged, taking another step back toward the hallway. She is ruining everything. I have a flight to catch. If I do not leave right now, my entire life is over. I will give you money, Malik. Whatever you want. Just let me pull the switch. Malik reached into the pocket of his hooded sweatshirt and pulled out a small electronic tablet. He tapped the screen a few times and then held it up so Julian could clearly see the display. Let us check your flight status, Malik said, his smile widening. Julian stared at the tablet screen. It displayed the private aviation tracking system for the local executive airport. His specific charter flight, the one he had paid a small fortune to secure, was highlighted in bright red letters. Status cancelled, Malik read aloud, tapping the screen for emphasis. Flight grounded by Federal Aviation Administration due to flagged passenger identity. Interpol alert issued. Julian's knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the edge of the granite kitchen island to keep himself from collapsing completely onto the floor. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His $15 million was frozen. His fake psychiatric evaluations were exposed. His money laundering scheme was broadcast to the people he stole from. And now his escape flight was permanently grounded. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. You really thought you could destroy my sister and walk away clean? Malik asked, stepping into Julian's personal space and forcing the coward to look him in the eye. You thought she was weak because she was quiet. You underestimated the wrong woman, Julian. Now walk back into the dining room before I decide to break your jaw again. Julian lowered his head in utter defeat. His shoulders slumped and he slowly turned around, shuffling back down the dark hallway like a condemned man walking to the gallows. Malik followed closely behind him, making sure the rat did not try to find another place to hide in the locked mansion. When Julian re-entered the dining room, the atmosphere was still incredibly tense. Monique was still weeping quietly on the floor, while Trevor paced back and forth near the locked patio doors, muttering angry threats under his breath. My parents were huddled together near the table, looking like two terrified children waiting for punishment. Julian collapsed into his chair at the far end of the table, burying his face in his hands. He did not say a word. He just sat there waiting for the inevitable end. Malik stepped into the light of the dining room and took a position standing directly behind my chair. His massive presence sent a fresh wave of anxiety rippling through the wealthy guests. They knew Malik was the wild card of the family, the one person who never cared about social status or church politics. Having him standing guard over me solidified the terrifying reality that I was in complete and absolute control of the room. I looked at the giant television screen. 18 minutes and 20 seconds left. The digital numbers pulsed with a steady rhythmic glow. I turned my attention back to my mother, who was still sitting on the floor, her designer dress bunched up around her knees. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes, her hands shaking as she clutched her expensive pearl necklace. You wanted me to sign those papers, Mom, I said, my voice cutting clearly through the quiet room. You wanted me to hand over my house and my dignity so Monique could keep pretending to be a successful agent. You wanted me locked in a hospital so your husband could keep laundering money through his holy charity. You sold my sanity to buy your own comfort. My mother opened her mouth to argue, to spin another desperate lie, but she stopped. She looked at the wire transfers still displayed on the left side of the screen. She looked at my father, who was staring at the table in disgraced silence. She finally realized that the carefully constructed illusion of the Vernon family was permanently shattered. "There are no more secrets left, Mom," I said, leaning forward slightly. "The Empire is dead, and we still have 18 minutes left to enjoy the funeral." The silence in the room stretched out cold and heavy after my words settled over the dining table. My mother knelt there on the hard marble floor, staring up at me with wide, panicked eyes. Brenda Vernon had never begged for anything in her entire life. She was a woman who demanded, who commanded who, expected the world to bow at her feet simply because she wore expensive clothes and stood next to a powerful preacher. But now her kingdom was in absolute ashes. The illusion of her perfect family had been broadcast and destroyed in front of the very people whose approval she valued more than her own children. She looked at the giant television screen still displaying Monique's fraudulent shell companies, and then she looked back at me. The haughty arrogance that usually defined her features was completely gone, replaced by the desperate animalistic terror of a cornered predator. Brenda suddenly lunged forward, closing the short distance between us. She wrapped her arms around my knees, burying her tear-streaked face into the wet silk of my midnight blue dress. "Vivian, please," she wailed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings with a jarring theatrical desperation. "Please, you have to stop this. I am your mother. I carried you in my womb. I gave you life. A mother's love is unconditional, Vivian. You are my flesh and blood. You cannot do this to us. You cannot destroy your own family. Think of the church. Think of your father's legacy. We can fix this. Whatever you want, whatever you need, we will give it to you. Just open the steel shutters and let these people leave before you do something we will all regret for the rest of our lives." I sat perfectly still and looked down at the woman clinging to my legs. I felt the warmth of her tears soaking through the fabric of my dress, but I felt absolutely no warmth in my heart. Her performance was incredibly convincing. To anyone else in the room, she looked like a heartbroken mother desperately trying to save her troubled daughter from making a catastrophic mistake. But I knew the truth. I knew her tears were not for me. They were for the offshore bank accounts she was about to lose. They were for the country club memberships and the designer handbags and the massive social influence that was slipping through her perfectly manicured fingers. I reached down and grabbed my mother by her wrists. My grip was firm and unyielding. I slowly peeled her hands off my legs and pushed her away, forcing her to sit back on her heels. "Unconditional love." I repeated, my voice dropping to a soft, dangerous whisper that somehow managed to command the attention of every single person in the dining room. "You dare to speak to me about a mother's unconditional love after what you and my husband have been planning for the last 2 years." I turned my gaze away from her horrified face and looked down at the encrypted burner phone resting in the palm of my hand. I tapped the screen one more time. The massive television display shifted instantly. The complex webs of Monique's real estate fraud and Julian's money laundering shell companies vanished into the digital ether. The screen went entirely black for a fraction of a second before a new document materialized in stark high definition. It was a scanned copy of an incredibly dense corporate contract. The venture capitalists and the church elders who had been watching my mother's pathetic breakdown on the floor immediately turned their attention back to the glowing screen. They squinted at the complex legal jargon, trying to decipher the new piece of evidence. Elder Davis took a hesitant step forward, adjusting his glasses. "What is this now?" Vivian Elder Davis asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. I stood up from my chair at the head of the table. I wanted everyone in the room to hear every single word I was about to say. "This," I announced, pointing a steady finger at the television screen, "is the real reason Julian brought those forged psychiatric evaluations to dinner tonight. This is the reason my mother has spent the last decade convincing everyone in our social circle that I am a fragile, unstable woman." The document on the screen was a comprehensive executive life insurance policy. The bold black letters at the top of the page clearly stated the name of the underwriting firm, which was one of the largest and most ruthless insurance conglomerates on the planet. Below the corporate letterhead, the details of the policy were laid out in chilling clarity. I let my eyes wander over the faces of the elite guests, ensuring they were paying absolute attention. As you can see, this is a massive life insurance policy taken out on my life, I explained, my voice echoing coldly off the marble walls. The payout in the event of my unexpected death is exactly $10 million. And if you look closely at the beneficiary line, you will see exactly who stands to inherit that fortune. The camera zoomed in on the specific section of the document displaying the primary and secondary beneficiaries. The first name listed was Julian. The second name listed was Brenda Vernon, my own mother. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Trevor, who had been standing near the locked patio doors, muttering to himself, suddenly went completely silent. He stared at the screen and then looked at Brenda with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Even in the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley venture capitalism, where stealing intellectual property was just another Tuesday, plotting the murder of a family member for an insurance payout was entirely unimaginable. But they could not just take out a $10 million policy on a perfectly healthy 35-year-old woman without raising massive red flags with the underwriters. I continued slowly pacing the length of the long dining table. The insurance company required extensive medical and psychological profiles to justify such an exorbitant policy. So Julian and my mother provided them with exactly what they needed. They attached an addendum to the policy utilizing the exact same fake psychiatric evaluations Julian tried to force me to sign tonight. I tapped my phone again and the screen split in half. On the left side was the $10 million insurance policy. On the right side were the forged medical documents heavily highlighted in yellow marker. The notes described a woman who was suffering from severe manic depressive episodes, severe paranoia, and a highly dangerous detachment from reality. They used these fake evaluations to legally establish my deteriorating mental health, I told the horrified room. They built a comprehensive paper trail depicting me as a deeply disturbed individual who was a constant danger to herself. They created a narrative that I was so severely depressed and psychotic that if I were to suddenly die in a tragic accident or suffer a fatal self-inflicted wound, absolutely no one would question it. The police would take one look at this medical history and rule it a tragedy. The insurance company would pay out the $10 million, no questions asked. And Julian and my mother would split the money to keep their failing empires afloat. I stopped pacing and looked directly down at Brenda, who was still sitting on the floor. Her face was completely devoid of color. She was staring at the television screen, her jaw trembling uncontrollably. The absolute evil of her betrayal was finally dragged out into the harsh light for everyone to witness. Staring at her pale face, the fragmented memories of my entire childhood suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity. The action-based backstory of my life had been a meticulously calculated setup. I remembered being 19 years old and feeling perfectly fine. But my mother had stood up in front of the entire church congregation during Sunday service and asked everyone to pray for my dark moods and my fragile mind. She had planted the seed of my instability in the minds of thousands of people. I remembered being 24 and catching a mild seasonal flu. My mother had insisted on bringing the family doctor to the house, and while I lay in bed running a slight fever, she stood in the hallway and told the doctor that I was prone to deep depressive episodes and emotional volatility. She made sure the doctor noted it in my official medical file. Every single time she called me a disappointment. Every single time she told the neighbors I was troubled. Every single time she publicly humiliated me for isolating myself. She was not just being a cruel parent. She was building a psychological profile. She was laying the foundation for my murder. She had spent over a decade carefully crafting the public perception of my insanity, so that when the day finally came to cash in her $10 million lottery ticket, my death would make perfect logical sense to the authorities. You called me unstable my entire life. Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You convinced the whole world that I was broken and depressed. You did not do it because you were disappointed in my career. You did it because you were setting the stage for my funeral. You and my husband were going to kill me, and you were going to use my own fake insanity as your alibi. The church elders physically recoiled, stepping away from my father and my mother, as if the very air around them was toxic. Elder Davis pulled his phone out again, frantically checking for a signal, desperately wanting to call the police to arrest the monster standing in the room. But the military-grade signal jammer was still blocking everything. There was no escape. "This is madness!" My father suddenly shouted, his voice cracking as the reality of his family's utter destruction set in. He pointed a shaking finger at Julian. "I knew nothing about this," Vernon screamed, his preacher persona completely abandoned. "I authorized the real estate transfers to save Monique, but I never agreed to an insurance policy. I never agreed to harm my own daughter. This is Julian's doing. He manipulated Brenda. He manipulated all of us." Julian, who had been sitting slumped in his chair at the far end of the table, under the watchful, imposing shadow of my brother Malik, suddenly bolted upright. His expensive ruined tuxedo was soaked in sweat. His eyes darted wildly around the room, trapped in a cage of his own making. His offshore money was gone. His Silicon Valley deal with Trevor was dead. His private escape flight had been grounded by Interpol. And now his conspiracy to commit murder had been fully exposed with hard, undeniable documentary evidence. Julian was a man who operated entirely on control and leverage. He was a predator who manipulated the law to suit his needs. But now, the law was a weapon pointed directly at his chest, and the timer on the massive television screen was ticking down his final moments of freedom. The bright red digital numbers shifted from 6 minutes to exactly 5 minutes and 0 seconds, 0500. The sudden change in the timer seemed to snap something fundamental inside Julian's brain. The calculating lawyer vanished entirely, leaving behind a desperate, cornered animal. He looked at the steel security shutters blocking the windows, and then he looked at me. His chest heaved as he let out a frantic, guttural breath. Julian suddenly dove toward the floor near his overturned chair. He scrambled wildly on his hands and knees, reaching for the heavy leather briefcase he had brought into the dining room earlier that evening. Malik shouted a warning and lunged forward to stop him, but the marble floor was slick with spilled wine and champagne. Malik's foot slipped, costing him a crucial fraction of a second. Julian grabbed the handle of the briefcase and violently snapped the brass latches open. He reached his hand deep inside the leather compartment, and when he pulled his arm back out, the room erupted into absolute pandemonium. Monique let out a blood-curdling scream and threw her body flat against the floor, covering her head with her hands. My mother scrambled backward, crab walking across the marble tiles until her back hit the base of the wall. The church elders shouted in sheer terror, throwing themselves behind the heavy wooden dining chairs for cover. Trevor froze entirely, his hands raised in the air as he backed slowly into the corner of the room. Julian was standing upright, holding a sleek black semi-automatic firearm. His hand was trembling violently as he gripped the weapon, but his eyes were completely devoid of reason. The safety click echoed sharply over the screams of the guests. He raised the barrel of the gun and leveled it directly at the center of my chest. Malik froze in his tracks, his massive frame positioned halfway between Julian and the table. Malik raised his hand slowly, his eyes locked on the trembling weapon. "Julian, do not do this." Malik warned, his voice low and steady, trying to de-escalate the massive spike in adrenaline. "You pull that trigger, and you are dead before you even hit the floor. Put it down." Julian ignored Malik completely. He kept the gun pointed squarely at my heart. The barrel shook slightly, mirroring the frantic, erratic beating of his own pulse. Sweat dripped down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he did not blink. "Turn off the jammer!" Julian screamed, his voice raw and ragged, tearing through the panicked sobs of the guests hiding on the floor. "Turn off the jammer and open the steel shutters right now." I did not move. I stood at the head of the long dining table, perfectly still, staring down the barrel of the gun. I had spent months preparing for this exact night. I had anticipated his financial moves, I had anticipated the fake medical evaluations, and I had anticipated the violence that always lurked just beneath his polished corporate exterior. You have exactly 4 minutes and 40 seconds left. Julian, I said, my voice eerily calm against the backdrop of the screaming room. Shooting me does not open the doors. Shooting me does not unfreeze your bank accounts. There is no override for the lockdown sequence. Shut up! Julian roared, his finger tightening visibly on the trigger. Open the doors! Reverse the malware on Trevor's servers and give me the access codes to the offshore accounts. If you let me walk out of here tonight, I will leave you alone forever. If you do not, I swear to God, Vivian, I will make that $10 million insurance payout happen tonight. I will put a bullet in your chest, and I will tell the police you pulled the gun on me during one of your psychotic episodes. They will believe me. They have the medical files. Open the doors. The red numbers on the screen ticked down relentlessly. 4 minutes and 15 seconds. The ultimate confrontation had finally arrived, and there were no more shadows left to hide in. The heavy black barrel of the gun was aimed directly at the center of my chest, its dark metal reflecting the dim light of the dining room as Julian stood there with his hands shaking in desperation. The sudden presence of a lethal weapon sent a massive wave of raw panic crashing through the room. The wealthy church elders and the Silicon Valley investors, who had spent their entire lives projecting an aura of untouchable superiority, were immediately and completely shattered. The sound of collective shrieking and frantic scrambling filled the air as men in expensive tailored suits threw themselves onto the cold marble floor, crawling over each other like frightened animals, trying to find any possible cover behind the heavy carved oak dining chairs. Elder Davis, the man who had just moments ago been shouting with righteous indignation, was now curled into a tight, pathetic ball near the corner, covering his head with his arms and weeping openly into the baseboards. Monique let out a deafening wail, pressing her face against the tiles, while Trevor remained entirely frozen in the opposite corner, offering absolutely no help to anyone, as the reality of the violence paralyzed him completely. I did not look at the screaming guests, or the cowering billionaires hiding in the shadows of my dining room. I kept my gaze fixed steadily forward, but my peripheral vision caught the movements of my parents. The two people who had brought me into this world, the people who were supposed to protect their child from any harm, were standing just a few feet away from a man who was actively threatening to end my life. My mother, Brenda, had both of her hands pressed tightly against her pale mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock, but she did not take a single step forward to intervene. She did not beg the man she had conspired with to lower the weapon and spare my life. She did not throw her body in front of the gun, the way a real mother would instinctively do for her daughter. Instead, she simply backed away, sliding her expensive designer shoes across the floor and pressing her spine flat against the far wall, preserving her own safety and leaving me entirely undefended. My father, the great Reverend Vernon, the man who stood at the pulpit every single Sunday morning and loudly preached to thousands of people about the power of sacrifice and divine protection, looked from the loaded gun back to my face. There was absolutely no fatherly instinct in his dark eyes. There was no righteous anger or protective fury burning within him. There was only a desperate, cowardly desire to avoid a public scandal that would ruin his pristine reputation and his fraudulent charity funds. Vivian, just do exactly what he says, my father pleaded, his deep voice cracking and pitching upward with pure, undiluted fear. Stop this foolishness right now and open the steel shutters. Just let him leave the house. Give him whatever he wants, Vivian, so nobody gets hurt. We cannot have violence and police in this house tonight. The authorities will ask too many questions, and the media will destroy everything we have built. Just open the door and let him go, so we can handle this quietly. The absolute profound cowardice of my father's words washed over me like a bucket of freezing water. He was entirely willing to let a man hold a loaded firearm to my chest and walk away with $15 million of my hard-earned money just to prevent a police investigation that might expose his own massive financial crimes. He was perfectly fine with his own daughter dying tonight, as long as his public reputation survived the morning. Julian smirked, his arrogant confidence returning slightly as he heard my father's pathetic capitulation to his violent demands. "You hear that?" Vivian Julian sneered, his finger tightening dangerously on the trigger of the gun. "Even your own father knows you are making a catastrophic mistake. Open the doors, or I swear to God, I will make the insurance payout happen tonight. I will put a bullet in your chest, and I will tell the cops you had a severe mental break and threatened everyone in this room with a weapon. They will look at the psychiatric files we created, and they will believe me. I will walk away completely clean, and you will be dead." But Julian had made a fatal miscalculation. He was so hyper-focused on intimidating me and listening to the cowardly pleas of my father that he completely forgot about the massive quiet presence standing directly to his right. Malik did not shout a warning command. He did not hesitate to assess the situation, and he certainly did not try to negotiate with an armed, desperate man. Malik moved with a sudden, terrifying velocity that was almost impossible to comprehend for a man of his immense size. It was not a frantic scramble, it was a blur of calculated, highly professional violence born of years of intense tactical training. Malik stepped in, closing the short gap before Julian's panicked brain could even register the sudden movement in his peripheral vision. Malik's left hand shot out like a heavy steel vise, grabbing the cylinder of the semi-automatic weapon and pushing it forcefully upward toward the high ceiling, redirecting the line of fire safely away from my chest. At the exact same split second, Malik's right hand delivered a devastating open palm strike directly to the crook of Julian's extended right elbow. The loud, sickening pop of bone and cartilage giving way echoed sharply through the dining room, cutting through the sounds of the weeping guests. Julian let out a piercing, agonizing scream as his arm buckled backward at an unnatural angle, and his fingers involuntarily released their tight grip on the firearm. Malik snatched the falling gun out of the air mid-drop, fluidly ejecting the magazine and clearing the live round from the chamber with rapid military precision, before sliding the now useless weapon safely into the deep pocket of his dark jeans. He executed the entire disarming sequence in less than 2 seconds. Before Julian could even process the blinding, white-hot pain radiating from his shattered elbow, Malik grabbed him by the thick fabric at the back of his neck and the leather belt of his ruined tuxedo trousers. With a brutal display of raw physical power, Malik hoisted Julian completely off his feet into the air and slammed him face first onto the polished wooden surface of the long dining table. The massive impact shattered the remaining crystal wine glasses and sent expensive china dinner plates crashing to the marble floor in a loud shower of sharp fragments. Julian's cheek bounced violently off the hard mahogany wood, and his nose immediately began to bleed profusely, staining the pristine white silk table runner with dark crimson drops. Malik planted his heavy knee directly into the small of Julian's back, pinning the lawyer down with so much concentrated downward pressure that Julian gasped frantically for air, struggling to inflate his crushed lungs. Malik grabbed Julian's unbroken left arm and twisted it forcefully up behind his back, holding him in a severe joint lock that promised immediate catastrophic dislocation if he dared to move a single inch. "You really should have checked my references much more carefully before you hired me to serve drinks at this little victory party." Julian Malik whispered, his voice a deep, rumbling menace right next to Julian's bleeding ear. The entire room fell absolutely dead silent, save for the panicked wheezing of the guests still cowering on the floor and the steady ticking of the countdown timer on the television screen. Julian groaned in sheer agony, spitting a mixture of blood and saliva onto the ruined table runner. "Who are you?" Julian choked out, his voice muffled against the wood as he tried unsuccessfully to squirm out from under Malik's crushing weight. "I am the older brother of a woman named Elena Reyes," Malik said softly, the calmness of his tone making the words infinitely more terrifying. The moment that specific name left Malik's lips, I watched Julian's entire body go completely rigid against the table. A fresh wave of cold sweat broke out across the back of Julian's neck, mingling with the spilled wine. "You remember Elena? Do you not?" "Julian?" Malik continued pressing his heavy knee, just a fraction of an inch deeper into Julian's lower spine, drawing a sharp, pathetic cry of pain from the man. She was a brilliant junior associate at your corporate law firm exactly 3 years ago. A beautiful young woman with a sharp mind and an incredibly bright future ahead of her. Until you decided that she belonged to you simply because you were a senior partner. The church elders hiding behind their chairs slowly raised their heads, staring up at the table and listening to the horrifying truth unfold. My father closed his eyes and slowly shook his head as the absolute depths of his son-in-law's depravity were finally dragged into the unforgiving light. You sexually harassed my little sister for 6 agonizing months. Malik stated, his voice trembling with a heavy, dark, and barely contained homicidal rage. You made her workplace a living hell. And when she finally gathered the courage to report your disgusting behavior to the Human Resources Department, you used your corporate power and your vast wealth to completely destroy her life. You illegally hacked into her private medical records using your firm's resources. You found out she had struggled with severe anxiety and depression during her college years, and you threatened to expose her personal private trauma to the entire legal community. You blackmailed a 24-year-old girl. You told her you would completely ruin her professional reputation and make absolutely sure she never practiced law in this state ever again if she did not drop the formal complaint against you. Julian whimpered pathetically as Malik twisted his trapped arm just a little higher toward his shoulder blades. You broke her mind, Julian, Malik said, his voice echoing loudly in the vast dining room, ensuring every single person heard the story. You backed her into a dark, terrifying corner until she felt like she had absolutely no way out of the nightmare you created. You drove my little sister to swallow an entire bottle of sleeping pills. If I had not come home early from my shift that night and found her unconscious and barely breathing on the bathroom floor, she would be dead right now because of your monstrous ego. She spent 3 terrifying weeks in an intensive care unit and 2 full years in intense psychiatric therapy, trying to slowly rebuild the beautiful life you shattered, just for your own sick amusement. You thought you were so entirely untouchable. Malik continued, glaring down at the pathetic, bleeding man pinned beneath him. You thought your massive wealth and your elite corporate connections made you a god who could crush anyone beneath your expensive shoes. But you made a massive mistake, Julian. You severely underestimated the people whose lives you destroyed. You see, my sister survived her attempt. She survived, and she finally told me everything you did to her. I spent the last 3 years tracking your every single move, learning your daily habits, digging through your complex digital footprint, and waiting patiently for the perfect opportunity to tear your entire life apart, piece by piece. And then, exactly 4 months ago, a brilliant cybersecurity architect reached out to me on an encrypted dark web forum. She had noticed you making highly suspicious offshore wire transfers, and she needed someone with my particular set of tactical and investigative skills to help her track the digital breadcrumbs. I stepped forward slowly, leaning over the ruined dining table, so my face was only inches away from Julian's bloody nose. You really thought I was just a clueless, naive wife sitting quietly designing software in the basement? I said, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. But Malik and I have been working together every single day for months, Julian. We tracked every single stolen dollar you moved. We found every fake corporate shell company you registered under my name. We found the forged $10 million life insurance policy and the fake psychiatric medical evaluations. We watched you conspire in the shadows with my own mother. We watched you steal donation money from my father's church. We meticulously documented every single crime you committed against me and against everyone else. We planned this entire evening down to the exact millisecond. You walked right into our trap smiling the whole time, and you locked the door behind you yourself. Julian lay pinned firmly to the table, his breathing incredibly ragged and shallow. His face was heavily smeared with his own blood. His expensive custom-tailored suit was torn. His deeply secret life was entirely dismantled and exposed, and he was now facing decades in a federal penitentiary for forgery, money laundering, and embezzlement. His parents-in-law had completely abandoned him, His offshore accounts were permanently frozen. His charter flight was grounded. There was absolutely nowhere left to run and no one left to manipulate. But instead of begging for mercy or breaking down in tears of regret, Julian did something completely unexpected and deeply chilling. He started to laugh. It began as a low, wet chuckle vibrating deep in his chest, and it quickly escalated into a loud, maniacal cackle that echoed disturbingly off the dining room walls. The sound was entirely devoid of sanity or reason. The church elders exchanged terrified, panicked glances, and even my mother stopped her pathetic sobbing to stare in horror at the man laughing hysterically on the table. "You think you won?" Julian laughed, coughing up a bright speck of blood onto the white silk table runner. "You really think you and this glorified security guard have outsmarted the great Julian Vernon? You think freezing my accounts and trapping me inside this house means you won the game, Vivian?" He twisted his neck painfully against the wood to look up at me, his eyes wide with an unhinged, frantic delight. "Look at the clock, Vivian," Julian sneered, his bloody teeth showing in a terrible mocking smile. "Look at the real time on the wall, not your stupid dramatic countdown timer. It is exactly 8:58 in the evening." My eyes darted quickly toward the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room, which confirmed the time was indeed exactly 8:58. Julian let out another sharp, deranged laugh that rattled in his throat. "You spent all these months tracking my old accounts," Julian gasped, struggling uselessly against Malik's punishing hold, but still managing to project his voice across the room. "You tracked the money I stole from the church and the money I hid with Monique. But you missed the masterstroke, my dear, brilliant wife. I knew you were getting suspicious of my activities weeks ago. So I set up a final contingency plan, a completely untraceable offshore routing system buried beneath 7 complex layers of dark web encryption. And I wrote a custom automated script linked directly to your company's primary financial holding accounts. You think you won? It is 8:58 in the evening. My automated script is transferring all your company's assets to my untraceable offshore account. In 2 minutes you are going to be broke, Vivian." The heavy silence in the dining room felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. After Julian screamed his final desperate threat, he was pinned flat against the ruined mahogany table by Malik, with his shattered arm twisted painfully behind his back, but a sick, victorious smile stretched across his bleeding face. 2 minutes, he gasped, spitting another drop of blood onto the white silk runner. "That is all it takes, Vivian. In exactly 120 seconds, everything you built will be completely gone, and I will be the one holding all the cards." My mother, Brenda, who had been cowering against the wall, suddenly stopped crying. A twisted glimmer of hope sparked in her eyes as she processed Julian's words. "My father." Reverend Vernon slowly lowered his hands from his face, looking at Julian as if the man were a messiah sent to deliver him from ruin. The venture capitalists, including Trevor, who had been hiding behind the heavy oak chairs, cautiously peeked out. They were all waiting for the clock to strike 9. They were all silently praying for my absolute destruction because my downfall was the only thing that could save their corrupt empires. I simply stood at the head of the table and stared down at the man I had once called my husband. I did not panic. I did not scream. I did not beg him to stop the automated transfer. I just watched the second hand of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room swing back and forth with a steady rhythmic tick. "You are remarkably quiet," Vivian Julian taunted. His voice strained under Malik's crushing weight. "Are you finally starting to understand what is happening? I told you I always win. You thought you were so clever bringing your brother here to play bodyguard and locking us inside this house. But you cannot punch a computer virus, Malik. You cannot shoot a dark web script. My Trojan horse is already inside her network, and there is absolutely nothing either of you can do to stop it." Malik did not react to the taunt. He kept his heavy knee planted firmly on Julian's spine and his grip on Julian's unbroken arm tight and unyielding. Malik looked up at me, his dark eyes calm and steady. We had spent months anticipating every single move Julian might make. We knew he was a cornered predator, and we knew he would try to set a trap. The digital numbers on the massive television screen shifted to 8:59. 60 seconds remained. I slowly walked around the long dining table, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor, stepping over the shattered crystal wine glasses and the broken china plates. The sound echoed loudly in the tense silence of the room. I stopped right next to where Julian was pinned and looked down at his arrogant, bleeding face. "You always underestimated me, Julian," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "You saw me as a naive wife, a convenient asset to build your wealth and a scapegoat for your crimes. You never truly understood who I am or what I do." The grandfather clock began its low mechanical whir, signaling that the hour was about to strike. The tension in the room spiked so high the air felt electric. Monique gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, waiting for the digital transfer that would supposedly save her fraudulent real estate shells. Trevor wiped sweat from his forehead, his eyes darting between me and the television screen. 10 seconds left," Julian whispered frantically, his chest heaving as he strained to look at the clock. 9:87. He was counting down his own supposed victory, his eyes wide with manic anticipation. 3, 2, 1. The heavy resonant chime of the grandfather clock struck 9 o'clock. The deep sound vibrated through the floorboards. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The room held its collective breath. Then a sharp, high-pitched electronic ping pierced the dead silence. The sound came from Julian's phone, which had fallen onto the marble floor during his scuffle with Malik. The screen lit up brightly in the dim room, signaling an incoming priority notification. Julian let out a wet, triumphant laugh. "There it is," he gasped, his body relaxing slightly against the table. "There is the confirmation. It is done, Vivian. Check your accounts. Check your company servers. You have absolutely nothing left." Malik calmly reached down and picked up the expensive device. He did not say a word as he held the phone up, letting the facial recognition software scan Julian's ruined face. The phone unlocked with a soft click. Malik read the notification on the screen. A slow, genuine smile spread across my brother's face. He lowered the phone and placed it flat on the mahogany table right in front of Julian's eyes. "Take a good look, lawyer," Malik said, his deep voice rumbling with quiet satisfaction. Julian squinted at the glowing screen. His victorious smile froze instantly. The blood seemed to rapidly drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His eyes widened in absolute unadulterated horror. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, but no sound came out. His breathing became frantic, shallow gasps of pure panic as his brain struggled to process the information displayed in front of him. I leaned down, resting my hands on the edge of the table, bringing my face just inches away from his. "Did you really think a self-taught cybersecurity founder would not notice a Trojan horse sitting on her own network?" I asked him, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Did you genuinely believe you could write a malicious script and sneak it past the very architecture I built from scratch? You are a corporate lawyer, Julian. You are not a coder. Your dark web encryption was absolutely laughable." I pulled my encrypted burner phone from the pocket of my midnight blue dress and tapped the screen one time. The massive television display on the wall shifted instantly. The complex webs of their crimes vanished and were replaced by a live mirrored feed of Julian's highly illegal offshore banking portal. The room gasped collectively. The account balance was displayed in giant bold green numbers: $55 million. That was the sum of his entire life of stealing, blackmailing, and laundering money. It was every single dime he had hidden from the Internal Revenue Service, every dollar he had siphoned from his corporate clients, and the exact amount he was planning to use to disappear after he framed me for his crimes. But the screen was not static. A red progress bar appeared at the very bottom of the display. It read, "Reverse routing sequence initiated." The wealthy investors and the church elders watched in stunned silence as the numbers on the screen began to plummet. 55 million dropped to 40 million in the blink of an eye. 40 million dropped to 20 million. 10 million. 5 million. No! Julian screamed, thrashing violently against the table, his voice tearing through the room with raw, animalistic terror. No, stop it, turn it off, Vivian. Turn it off right now. The numbers continued to fall rapidly. 1 million, 500,000, 10,000, $0.00. The screen flashed a final message. Transfer complete. Destination account secured. Julian let out a pathetic whimpering sound, tears of absolute defeat mixing with the blood smearing his face. His chest heaved as he stared at the zeros on the television screen. His untraceable offshore fortune, the money he had literally plotted a murder to protect, was entirely gone. I did not just stop your little Trojan horse, Julian, I explained, standing up straight and addressing the horrified room. I reverse engineered it. I used your own malicious script as a digital bridge directly into your highly encrypted network. The moment the clock struck 9, your script did not drain my accounts. It opened the back door for my custom malware to completely drain yours. My mother let out a sharp, breathless shriek, pressing her hands against her chest, as if she were having a heart attack. My father gripped the edge of his chair, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape that did not exist. But I did not stop there. I continued, my voice echoing coldly off the marble walls. If I simply took your money, I would be no better than a common thief. I would be just like you and my father and Trevor. I did not keep a single dime of your filthy cash. Trevor, who had been slowly edging toward the hallway, suddenly froze, his face draining of all color. What did you do? Trevor demanded, his voice cracking with fear. I looked directly at the Silicon Valley billionaire. I programmed the script to funnel every single penny of Julian's personal wealth, along with all of your remaining hidden assets, Trevor, and the millions of dollars stolen from the church charity funds, directly to a very specific destination. I tapped my phone again. The television screen changed to show a highly secure routing confirmation document bearing the official seal of the United States government. I routed the entire $55 million directly into a secure holding account belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. I announced loudly, ensuring every person in the room understood the absolute finality of their destruction. And I made absolutely sure to attach Julian's personal digital signature and Reverend Vernon's church authorization codes to the massive wire transfer. The silence that followed my words was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. It was the sound of complete systemic annihilation. The federal authorities now have all of your stolen money, I explained, pacing slowly back toward the head of the table. They have the transaction ledgers. They have the forged real estate deeds Monique signed. They have the offshore routing numbers linking my father's holy charity directly to Julian's massive international money laundering ring. And they have the $10 million life insurance policy showing your exact motive for fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. My father collapsed backward into his chair, his entire ministry and his entire life completely eradicated in the span of 30 seconds. He stared blankly at the ceiling, a broken, hollow shell of the powerful preacher he had pretended to be. Brenda was sitting on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her designer makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Her country club memberships, her expensive cars, her social influence, all of it was gone forever. Trevor dropped to his knees, utterly ruined, knowing he would be going to a federal penitentiary alongside his corrupt wife Monique, who was now curled into a tight ball, weeping into the marble tiles. Elder Davis and the other church leaders simply stood there, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the crimes they had been complicit in hiding. Julian stopped struggling against Malik. He lay perfectly still on the ruined table, his breathing incredibly ragged and shallow. His arrogance was completely extinguished. His wealth was gone. His freedom was permanently forfeit. He had tried to bury me in a psychiatric ward to steal my life, and instead he had handed the federal government the exact irrefutable evidence they needed to lock him away for the rest of his natural life. They had walked into this house tonight believing they were the untouchable elite. They believed they could lie, cheat, and steal their way to the top without ever facing a single consequence. They thought they could use me as their ultimate scapegoat and cast me aside when I was no longer useful. But the scapegoat had locked the doors and burned their entire empire to the ground. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The atmosphere in the room felt entirely different now. The oppressive weight of their lies and their manipulation had been completely lifted. I looked at Malik, who stepped back from the table, releasing his punishing hold on Julian. Julian simply slid off the mahogany wood and collapsed onto the marble floor, curling into a pathetic, broken heap without making a single sound. Malik stood tall, adjusting his dark hooded sweatshirt, looking incredibly satisfied with the evening's work. We had done exactly what we set out to do. We had protected Elena's honor. We had secured my freedom, and we had taken out the trash. Then a new sound pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room. It started faint and distant, a low, wailing noise echoing through the cold night air outside the mansion. The sound grew steadily louder, rising and falling in a familiar, urgent rhythm. Sirens. The wealthy investors and the corrupt church elders turned their heads toward the locked steel shutters, their eyes wide with fresh, blinding panic. The wailing of the sirens multiplied rapidly, indicating a massive, coordinated emergency response. Police cruisers, federal agents, and tactical vehicles were speeding up the long, winding driveway of my estate. The sound grew deafeningly loud, shaking the very walls of the dining room and drowning out the pathetic sobs of my parents. Suddenly, the dark room was illuminated by a chaotic strobe of flashing red and blue lights. The intense emergency lights pierced through the tiny horizontal gaps in the heavy steel security shutters, casting long, strange, moving shadows across the terrified faces of my family and former friends. Elder Davis scrambled backward, pressing himself into the corner as if he could somehow melt into the drywall. Monique wailed louder, grabbing Trevor's arm, but he just pushed away, staring blankly at the flashing lights. My father simply sat in his chair, muttering a silent, desperate prayer to a god he had spent his entire life exploiting and ignoring. I pulled my burner phone from my pocket one final time. I looked down at the encrypted interface, the system I had built from scratch to protect myself from the monsters in my own home. I tapped the screen, pressing the master override sequence for the lockdown protocol. A loud, heavy mechanical clunk echoed through the walls as the biometric deadbolts simultaneously disengaged. The thick steel security shutters covering the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and the patio doors began to slowly retract. The loud grinding of the metal gears filled the room as the heavy barriers rolled upward toward the ceiling. The flashing red and blue lights flooded the dining room, completely illuminating the absolute ruin of the dinner party. The shattered crystal, the spilled wine, the broken expensive plates, and the defeated pathetic criminals cowering on the floor were all exposed to the glaring, harsh lights of justice. Armed federal agents were already swarming the patio, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and aiming directly into the dining room. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and smoothed the fabric of my dress. I looked at Malik, who smiled and offered a respectful nod before stepping back to let the authorities do their job. I looked out at the sea of red and blue lights, knowing that in a matter of seconds, a tactical team would breach the entryway and arrest every single conspirator in the room. Right on time, I said. The heavy oak front doors of the mansion burst open with a deafening crash that shook the entire foyer. At the exact same moment, a dozen heavily armed tactical agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission swarmed through the retracted patio doors. Their heavy boots pounded against the marble floors, and bright tactical flashlights cut through the dim lighting of the dining room. Stern, authoritative voices shouted commands ordering everyone to get down and keep their hands visible. The absolute chaos that erupted was a spectacular symphony of collapsing egos and shattered illusions. The Silicon Valley elite and the untouchable religious leaders who had just spent the evening sipping rare vintage wine and plotting my murder were now scrambling over each other like terrified rats caught in a blinding light. Trevor immediately threw his hands high into the air, his face a mask of sweaty, terrified desperation. "Wait!" You have the wrong man! Trevor screamed, his voice cracking as two federal agents aggressively backed him against the dining room wall. I am a victim here. I did not know what Julian was doing. I was tricked. You cannot do this to me. I have lawyers. I am a victim. The lead SEC agent did not even blink as he grabbed Trevor's arms and roughly pulled them behind his back. Trevor Holloway, you are under arrest for massive intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, and multiple counts of international wire fraud, the agent recited coldly as the heavy metal cuffs clicked securely around Trevor's wrists. Your digital servers have already been seized by our cyber division, and we have every single email you sent to Julian Vernon. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it. Across the room, my father was attempting to mount a defense built entirely on his manufactured righteous indignation. He puffed out his chest, smoothing the lapels of his expensive custom suit, and raised his hands in a gesture of pastoral authority. Gentlemen, please, my father boomed, using his deep, resonant preaching voice that had completely controlled thousands of devoted followers for decades. There is a massive misunderstanding here. I am Reverend Vernon. I am a respected man of God and a pillar of this community. You are desecrating a holy man's home, and I demand you lower your weapons immediately. But his devoted followers were no longer under his spell. The church elders who had discovered his massive theft of their charity funds just minutes earlier saw their one and only chance at salvation. Elder Davis scrambled up from the floor, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at my father's chest. Do not listen to him! Elder Davis shouted to the FBI agents, his voice thick with betrayal and panic. He is a fraud and a thief. He stole $15 million from the church orphanage fund and tried to launder it through offshore shell companies. He is the one you want. He orchestrated the embezzlement. Arrest him. We had absolutely nothing to do with it. My father's pastoral facade completely disintegrated as the federal agents converged on him. His authoritative posture collapsed, and he began to stammer incoherently as they forced his arms behind his back. The great Reverend Vernon, the man who had demanded my absolute obedience and tried to sell my life for a clean reputation, was frog-marched out of his own dining room in disgrace. Then there was Julian. Two heavily armed agents hauled him up from the marble floor. His expensive ruined tuxedo was covered in his own blood and wine. His shattered arm hung uselessly at his side, but he fought against the agents with the wild, frantic energy of a completely broken man. His eyes darted around the room until they finally locked onto me. I stood next to Malik, watching the destruction of his empire with perfect calm. Julian screamed, his voice raw and ragged, tearing his throat as the agents dragged him forcefully toward the patio doors. Vivian, you cannot do this to me. I am your husband. Vivian, look at me. Vivian, please. His screams echoed across the sprawling manicured lawns as they dragged him out into the cold night air and shoved him into the back of a waiting federal vehicle. The man who had meticulously built a psychological profile to justify my murder was now shrieking my name like a madman, exactly as he had planned for me to do. The dining room slowly cleared of the screaming men, leaving behind a scene of absolute ruin. The beautiful mahogany table was scratched and stained with blood. The expensive china lay in shattered pieces across the floor. And standing amidst the wreckage of their completely destroyed lives were my mother Brenda and my sister-in-law Monique. Monique looked around wildly, her eyes wide with animalistic panic. Her husband was in handcuffs. Her fraudulent real estate empire was exposed, and the federal agents were currently moving through the mansion, securing the premises. Suddenly, Monique bolted toward the grand staircase. I just need my things, Monique cried out, her heels slipping on the marble as she scrambled toward the steps. I need my jewelry and my bags. They belong to me. I just need to pack my things. A female federal agent stepped smoothly into her path, holding up a firm hand. I am afraid that will not be possible, ma'am, the agent said coldly. This entire estate, every vehicle on the property, every piece of jewelry inside that safe and all connected bank accounts have just been officially seized by the federal government under the RICO Act. You do not own any of this anymore. Everything is frozen as evidence of an ongoing criminal conspiracy. You need to vacate the premises immediately." Monique let out a devastated, sobbing wail and collapsed onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, burying her face in her hands. My mother stood entirely alone in the center of the ruined dining room. The haughty, arrogant matriarch, who had spent her entire life judging everyone around her, was completely broken. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled and stained. Her perfect hair was a mess. Dark black streaks of mascara ran down her pale cheeks, making her look old and incredibly pathetic. She looked at the federal agents securing her beloved, expensive belongings, and then she turned slowly to look at me. The sheer audacity of her next move was almost breathtaking. Despite having just watched me expose a plot to end my life, a plot she had actively participated in, my mother's deeply ingrained entitlement still refused to die. She walked toward me, her hands trembling, reaching out as if to touch my arm. "Vivian, please," my mother whimpered, her voice shaking with desperate pleading. "Vivian, you have to help us. They are taking everything. They are taking my cars and my clothes and my home. You are the only one left with any money, Vivian. Your company is worth billions. You have to let us stay here. You have to pay for the lawyers. You cannot just leave your mother out on the street. I am your family, Vivian. You have to protect us." I looked down at her tear-stained face, feeling absolutely no pity, no sadness, and no obligation. The invisible chains she had wrapped around my neck since I was a little girl had finally snapped. I reached into the pocket of my dress and slowly pulled out a crisp, officially notarized document. I unfolded it deliberately, letting the heavy silence stretch between us as my mother stared at the paper with desperate confusion. "You seem to be suffering from a massive misunderstanding." "Mom," I said, my voice echoing smoothly in the quiet room. "You see, when I uncovered your plan to murder me and use my fake insanity as an alibi, I realized I needed to secure my assets. But I also realized that the federal government would seize everything with Julian and Dad's names on it." I held the document up so the emergency lights flashing from outside illuminated the bold black text at the top of the page. "So 2 weeks ago, I quietly purchased this entire estate through an anonymous corporate proxy," I explained, watching her eyes widen in fresh horror. "The federal government is not seizing this house tonight, Mom, because Julian and Vernon do not own it anymore. I do. This is my house now and you are trespassing." My mother stared at the deed in my hand, her mouth opening and closing as her brain completely short-circuited. She looked around the grand foyer at the federal agents cataloging her expensive art collection and then back to my face. "You cannot do this!" She finally choked out, her voice dropping to a pathetic, raspy whisper. "You cannot throw your own mother out onto the street in the middle of the night, Vivian. This is my home." I folded the crisp legal document and slid it back into the pocket of my dress. "Actually, Brenda," I said, using her first name to sever the final remaining tie between us, "I am not the one throwing you out. I did own this house, but I sold it to a commercial real estate developer yesterday morning. The transaction has completely cleared, and the new owners take full physical possession of the property at exactly midnight tonight. They plan to bulldoze this entire mansion next week to build a luxury condominium complex." Monique let out a strangled gasp, pulling at the roots of her hair. "Bulldoze it!" she shrieked, looking wildly at the crystal chandeliers and the sweeping marble staircase. "But my clothes, my designer bags, my shoes, I need time to pack a moving truck." A federal agent stepped forward, crossing his arms over his dark tactical vest. "The property and all major assets inside have been flagged in our investigation," he stated firmly. "Anything purchased with illicit funds stays right here." I looked at the antique grandfather clock that had signaled Julian's absolute downfall just an hour earlier. "It is currently 9:15 in the evening." I told them, my voice completely devoid of any anger or malice. "That means you have exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes to find some heavy-duty garbage bags in the kitchen pantry and pack whatever basic necessities you can carry on your shoulders. Anything left behind at midnight belongs to the demolition crew." But where will we go? My mother pleaded, tears streaming through her ruined makeup. We have absolutely no money, no cars, no credit cards. How are we supposed to survive? Vivian, please, you have to give us something. I looked at the woman who had happily conspired to lock me in a psychiatric ward just so she could maintain her country club membership. You will have to figure it out, I said smoothly. Perhaps you can ask one of your wealthy socialite friends for a spare room. Or maybe you can finally learn how to work for a living. There was no screaming on my end. There were no dramatic arguments or theatrical declarations of vengeance. There was just the cold, hard, absolute reality of consequences finally catching up to people who had outrun them for decades. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the heavy oak front doors. Malik fell into step beside me, his presence a silent, reassuring shield against the chaos we were leaving behind. I stepped out into the crisp night air, taking a deep, refreshing breath. The driveway was swarming with police cruisers and federal transport vehicles. I paused at the end of the long walkway and turned around to look at the estate one last time. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see federal agents systematically dismantling the glamorous facade my parents had built. About an hour later, as Malik and I sat in the back of a private car, waiting for our driver to navigate the crowded driveway, I watched the final pathetic act of the Vernon family legacy unfold. My mother and my sister-in-law trudged slowly out of the front doors. They were not wearing their expensive furs or carrying their designer luggage. They were each dragging a heavy black plastic garbage bag over the pristine marble porch. They stumbled down the steps and slumped onto the cold concrete curb, waiting for a taxi they could barely afford. Federal agents moved in behind them, pulling bright yellow police tape across the grand columns of the estate, sealing it off from the world forever. I tapped the glass window of the car, signaling the driver to pull away. I did not look back again. Exactly 6 months later, the warm morning sun bathed the terrace of a small, exclusive cafe in Paris. A gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly baked croissants and rich espresso across the patio. I sat at a wrought iron table overlooking the magnificent sweeping architecture of the Eiffel Tower. It was the exact picturesque destination Julian had bragged about, the place he had planned to escape to with my stolen fortune. But Julian was not in Paris. I was. I took a sip of my espresso and smiled as Malik approached the table carrying 2 fresh pastries. He was no longer wearing his tactical gear or his dark hooded sweatshirts. He was dressed in a sharp tailored suit, looking perfectly at home among the European business elite. As my newly appointed head of corporate security, he had spent the last 6 months ensuring that my company's digital and physical architecture was entirely impenetrable. He sat down across from me and opened a sleek leather folder. "The quarterly reports are in Vivian," he said, a proud smile breaking across his face. "Our new artificial intelligence security software has been adopted by 3 major international banking conglomerates. The revenue projections for the next fiscal year are up by 400%. The market completely loves the new expansion." I nodded, opening my laptop to review the soaring financial charts. The company I had built in the basement of that toxic mansion was now a global powerhouse. I had completely severed the dead weight of my past, and the resulting growth was nothing short of explosive. I was surrounded by people who respected me, who valued my intellect, and who would never betray my trust. As I scrolled through the incredible revenue reports, my phone buzzed softly on the table. The screen lit up with a breaking news alert from a major American media outlet. The headline read clearly across the glass: "Former prominent pastor and Silicon Valley investment banker sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for massive embezzlement and wire fraud conspiracy." I stared at the names Vernon and Holloway for a brief, quiet moment. I thought about the dark dining room, the loaded gun, the cowardly pleas, and the shattered crystal. It all felt like a lifetime ago, a bad movie that had finally reached the end of its credits. I did not feel the need to read the article. I did not need to know the details of their sentencing or the miserable conditions of their new reality in a federal penitentiary. I simply swiped my finger across the screen and deleted the notification permanently. I picked up my espresso cup, taking another slow, deliberate sip as I looked out at the beautiful Parisian skyline. The past was completely dead and buried beneath the rubble of an old mansion. I closed my laptop and turned my attention back to the bright sunlit morning. My future was absolutely limitless. The greatest lesson from this journey is that true power does not come from manipulation or stolen wealth. It comes from trusting your own resilience and building a life on your own terms. When toxic family members try to use your vulnerabilities against you, they only expose their own weakness. You never have to accept the role of the scapegoat. By standing firm in your truth and protecting your boundaries, you can turn your deepest betrayals into your greatest triumphs. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story below and subscribe.